Okay, let's get started. I want to begin today's deep dive with something that, at first glance seems almost insignificant. It's a tiny detail.
Almost a footnote.
Exactly. It's a linguistic nuance we found right at the top of our source material. We're looking at a name on a page. And if you're just reading the official reports, the English translations of the IDF briefings, the surname is spelled Gueelee.
Right. And if you're an English speaker, you'd look at that and you'd stumble. You might say Gigili, maybe Gvilli. It looks awkward on the page.
It doesn't flow.
Yeah.
So the pronunciation, the actual Hebrew pronunciation, the way his family says his name, and the way his unit would have called it out is Gvilli.
Ran Gvilli.
And it feels important to start there because that small correction, that move from the awkward transliteration to the real name, it humanizes everything that follows.
It absolutely does. It stops being about a file or a report, and it becomes about a person, a specific young man with a life, a family, a story.
And that specific person, Sergeant Major Ran Gvilli, is at the very heart of a massive, cruelly historic event that we're unpacking.
The headline event is the recovery of his body from the Gaza Strip.
But even that word recovery, it feels a little cold, doesn't it? A little clinical.
It does. It sounds like you're recovering a piece of equipment or a downed drone. For his parents, Talik and Itzik, this isn't a recovery. It's the end of an agonizing wait. It's bringing their son home.
But you're right to use the word historic, because this operation, as our sources lay out, marks a major turning point in this conflict.
It's a turning point that's defined by a number. A statistic in an IDF briefing that, I have to admit, I had to read twice.
I did too. It just didn't seem possible at first.
The IDF states that with the return of Ran Gvilli, for the first time since 2014, let that sink in, since 2014, there are no Israeli hostages, living or deceased, left inside the Gaza Strip.
A decade. That's a full decade. It covers multiple operations, periods of calm, flare-ups, and of course, cataclysm of October 7th. To be able to say that slate is now clean, it's a profound strategic and emotional shift.
It's a closing of a file that has been open for a very, very long time. It changes the leverage in any future negotiations. It changes the psychological landscape of the country.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack the significance of this one operation. We're going to get into the weeds of the how, which is a forensic and military story that honestly sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. It's an incredible piece of detective work under fire.
And then we're going to explore the why this matters so much, which takes us into some very deep, very intense moral, religious, and geopolitical territory.
And we've got a really diverse stack of sources to work with today. It's not just one perspective.
No, it's layered. What are we looking at?
Okay, so we have the raw operational briefings from the IDF. These are very tactical, very direct. Then we have the forensic reports from the National Center for Forensic Medicine in Tel Aviv, which are very scientific and detached.
The cold, hard.
Exactly. Then, on a completely different level, we have transcripts from JTV, the global Jewish channel, and they provide a much deeper philosophical and historical analysis.
And to top it all off, we have high-level political documents. We've got transcripts of speeches from the Knesset featuring Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also, really in twist, the Albanian Prime Minister, Rama.
So you've got these three distinct layers running through everything today: the immediate military operation, the timeless religious duty of burial, and then this huge overarching geopolitical argument about the entire history of the conflict.
So let's start at the beginning, Section 1, the operation. And let's start with the man himself, who was Ran Gvilli.
Ran was 24 years, just 24, and he was a fighter in Yassam.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with all the acronym of the Israeli security forces, what is Yassam?
So Yassam is the special patrol unit of the Israeli. Think of them as a kind of elite tactical unit. They're not the people writing traffic tickets. They're the ones on the heavy-duty motorcycles, trained for riot control, high-risk arrests, and crucially, counter-terror operations.
The front line of urban warfare.
Very much so. They are tough, highly trained operators, and Ran was one of them.
And the sources use this one phrase to describe him it's heartbreaking, but it's also incredibly powerful. They call him first to jump, last to arrive.
That phrase tells you everything. First to jump is about October 7th, 2023. That morning, when the first alerts, the first frantic calls started coming from the south, Ran didn't wait. He didn't wait for a formal order for his unit to mobilize.
He just went.
He was a first responder in the purest sense of the word. He got his gear, got on his bike, and rode south, straight into the inferno.
And he was killed in combat that morning, fighting to defend those communities.
He was. And his body was taken by terrorists into Gaza. So that's the first half of the phrase, last to arrive, refers to the fact that now, all these months later, he is the last of that initial group of defenders whose bodies were taken to finally come home for burial.
There's a tragic symmetry to that. The first to act, the last to be returned.
It's a closed circle. He answered the call immediately, and now the nation is finally answering.
Let's get into the intelligence work behind this, because this wasn't an accident. They didn't just stumble upon his grave during a patrol. This was a massive, painstaking intelligence operation.
And very frustrating. The sources make it clear that intelligence agencies had a general idea of his location for a while. This wasn't a cold case with zero leads. They had chatter, they had information.
But general, in a place like Gaza City, not very.
It's almost worse than knowing nothing, because you know he's somewhere in this dense, hostile urban area, but you can't act. Pinpointing a single grave in a city of millions is like finding a needle in a haystack made of needles.
And the source mentions that some of this information was even confirmed by Hamas through mediators.
Yes, which is one of those surreal details of modern conflict. While the kinetic war has happened, airstrike, tank battles, there are these quiet, parallel, back-channel communications going on, negotiations about the locations of the dead.
It's bizarre.
It is. But even with that mediated information, it wasn't a straight path. The sources detail several agonizing false leads that the teams had to run down.
And this really illustrates the fog of war.
Absolutely. For example, one early piece of intelligence suggested he might have been buried at Shifa Hospital,
Which we now know was a major Hamas command and control center, so it made a certain kind of grim sense.
It did. But here was the problem. At the time that intelligence was received, Shifa was deep inside Hamas-controlled territory. The IDF hadn't maneuvered there yet. So they had this piece of information, this potential location, but their hands were tied.
They couldn't just launch a raid on the biggest hospital in Gaza based on a maybe.
Exactly. It would have been a massive international incident and a huge military risk, so they had to wait. Another lead pointed to a different cemetery altogether, but again, it was in an area they didn't yet control. It's this constant state of knowing, but being unable to act.
Then there's the tunnel. This part of the report reads like an engineer's worst.
Oh, it's just brutal. A more solid piece of intelligence came in, pointing to a specific tunnel. It was about 1 kilometer away from where they eventually found him.
So close, yet so far.
Painfully close. So they send in the combat engineers, the lone guys, the elite tunnel warfare unit, and they have to go down into the dark.
Which is already the most dangerous environment a soldier can be in.
Without a doubt. You're worried about booby traps, ambush points, lack of oxygen, structural collapse.
Yeah.
It's a death trap on a good day. But they went in. The sources say they dug, they scanned the walls, the floors, using ground-penetrating radar and other sensors. They took that tunnel apart.
Looking for any sign of a concealed barrier.
Any anomaly, any disturbed earth, anything.
What did they find?
Nothing. Empty. Just dust and rock.
I can't even imagine the psychological blow that must have been. You risk your life, you're certain this is it, and you come up.
It's got to be crushed. But they didn't give up. The intelligence services, Shin Bet and military intelligence, they just kept working the problem, squeezing their sources, analyzing signals, putting the puzzle pieces together until the picture finally sharpened.
And it pointed them to a specific location.
A Muslim cemetery in the eastern part of Gaza.
Okay, so this is where the operation shifts from, a difficult search into something that is almost logistically unbelievable. The sheer scale of what next.
It's staggering. And you have to remember, this isn't a quiet civilian operation. This is happening in a hostile area. They didn't just walk up to a grave with a headstone. The information they had was that he was buried somewhere in this cemetery.
So what did they...
To find Ran Gvilli, the IDF exhumed approximately 250 bodies.
Wait, hold on. 100.
250 graves opened up over the course of a single weekend.
In a combat zone. How is that even possible? I mean, I've seen documentaries on forensic exhumation. It's a slow, delicate process with brushes and screen. Doing 250 in 48 hours while you could be taking sniper fire or RPGs, It's mind-boggling.
It required a massive, coordinated effort. First, you have the security element. You have tanks and infantry forming a hard perimeter, a bubble of safety around the cemetery. Then you have the operational teams doing the heavy lifting.
The digging.
And then you have the forensic prop. And this is where the sources reveal a really brilliant, if grim, piece of battlefield innovation.
They couldn't use standard DNA tests.
No way. It's way too slow. Think about the timeline. You take a sample, you have to keep it sterile, you fly it back to a lab in Tel Aviv, you run the PCR. You're talking days, best case scenario.
Yeah.
You can't hold a static, exposed position in Gaza City for days waiting for lab results.
You'd be a sitting duck.
A huge sitting duck. They needed an answer on site in real time.
Okay.
So they came up with a different solution. They deployed dentists.
Dentists to a cemetery in Gaza.
Field dent. Members of the IDF Medical Corps, they brought them right to the cemetery, and they had Ran's dental records with them, his x-rays, his chart. They knew the unique structure of his jaw, maybe a specific filling he had, a root canal, the shape of a molar.
So they were doing a physical comparison.
Right there in the dirt. As each body was exhumed, the dentists were there, examining the dental structure.
That is visceral. I don't even have a word for that.
It's grim, but it's incredibly bodily effect. Teeth are one of the most durable parts of the human body. They can survive things that other tissues can't. And they're as unique as a fingerprint.
So it was just a process of elimination.
A long, grueling process. Body after body, no match. Re-enter. Neck, no match. Imagine the tension, the focus required. For 249 times, the answer was no.
Until it wasn't.
Until finally a dentist looks at the records, looks at the jawbone, and says, this is it. We have a match.
And only then, after that field confirmation, was he moved.
Only then. Once the dentist gave the preliminary thumbs up, his body was carefully transported to the National Center for Forensic Medicine for the final definitive verification with fingerprints and DNA testing. But the crucial identification, the one that allowed the operation to succeed, happened right there in the cemetery.
There's another detail in the reports about what happened after they found him that really stood out to me. You'd think, okay, mission accomplished, find your guy and get out of there as fast as you can.
Leave the mess. It's a war zone. Who cares?
Right, but that's not what they did.
No. The source material is very explicit on this point. Before the unit withdrew, they reinterred the other 249 bodies they had exhumed.
They put them back.
They put them back. And the briefing uses the phrase, they cleaned up the cemetery, they tried to restore the gravesites, to put things back as they were.
Why? Why take the time? Why take the risk?
The source frames it as a matter of principle, a deep-seated respect for the dead. Even in a war against a brutal enemy, even when searching for your own fallen comrade, there are lines you don't cross. It wasn't a desecration, it was a surgical, forensic operation, and they closed the wounds they had opened in the earth before they left.
This feels like the perfect transition, because that act of respect for the dead, even the enemy's dead, brings us directly to the central question of this whole deep dive.
The why?
The why. Why do this? Why risk the lives of dozens, maybe hundreds of soldiers? Why deploy dentists to a battlefield? Why meticulously move 250 bodies to find one man who has been dead for months?
And for that answer, you have to close the IDF operational briefing and open up the JTV transcript, because you cannot possibly understand the military logic here without first understanding the theology behind it.
The source begins by talking about this idea of a sacred duty.
It does. And it starts, interestingly enough, with another linguistics lesson. It goes back to the very first book of the Bible. It looks at the Hebrew word for man.
Adam, as in Adam and Eve.
Exactly. And the source points out something that, most people probably don't realize. The word Adam is directly derived from the Hebrew word Adamah.
And Adamah means
earth, ground, soil.
So a human being in Hebrew is literally an earthling, a creature of the ground.
Precisely. And in many traditions, that's seen as a sign of being lowly. From dust you came and to dust you shall return. It's about humility.
That's the standard interpretation I've always heard.
But the JTV source presents a radically different take on it. It argues that the fundamental human project in Judaism isn't for the soul to escape the dirty physical body and fly off to some ethereal heaven.
Which is a very common spiritual idea, that the body is just a vessel, a temporary shell you discard.
Right, a disposable container for the important part, which is the soul. But the Jewish view, as presented here, is the complete opposite. The goal isn't to get earth up to heaven. The goal is to bring heaven down to earth.
To sanctify
the physical. The body isn't a prison for the soul. It's the soul's partner in making the world a holy place. It's the hands that do good deeds, the feet that walk to the synagogue, the mouth that speaks words of kindness.
So the body has its own inherent sanctity. It's not just a wrapper.
It's an essential part of the holy equation. The source argues that when God forms man, he fuses the dust of the earth with the soul from heaven. And that fusion creates something new and permanently sacred. You don't just throw half of that sacred creation away when it stops breathing.
This also connects to eschatology, the beliefs about the end of days.
Yes, very much so. The source material references the core belief in Techiat Hamed, the resuscitation of the dead in the Messianic era.
The idea that the righteous will live
and live again in their bodies. The belief isn't just that their souls will be rewarded, but that their souls will return to their preserved physical form. So if you hold that belief, then a proper Jewish burial in the soil of Israel isn't just about closure or memory.
It's a practical purpose.
It's a down payment on eternity. You're preserving the vessel for its future use. It's a very literal, very physical expectation.
So you have this ancient, powerful religious imperative. How does that filter down into the mindset of a modern secular state and its military?
It becomes the national ethos. It gets woven into the social contract. The JTV source makes the argument that Israel is unique in this regard, that no other nation on earth goes to such extraordinary lengths for its fallen.
It's not just a slogan, we don't leave anyone behind.
It's an operational doctrine. It's the promise the state makes to every soldier who puts on the uniform. It goes back to that phrase we started with, first to jump, last to arrive.
The state is fulfilling its side of the bargain.
It's saying, you were the first to jump for us. You put your body on the line without hesitation. So we, the nation, will not rest. We will not sleep. We will not count the cost until your body is brought home. It's a sacred debt.
And for the family. The source describes the news as bitter.
And you can understand why. For Ran's parents Talek and Itzik. This news is the final, irreversible end of any tiny, irrational flicker of hope that he might have survived, that he might be a prisoner somewhere.
The finality of death.
The finality of death. But it's also the beginning of peace. It's the end of uncertainty. They can mourn. They have a place to go, a grave to visit. They have closure. That's the duty the state just fulfilled.
Okay, so we've established the how of the operation, this incredible forensic effort, and the why, this deep theological and national imperative. Now, the source material takes a very sharp turn. It zooms way, way out.
From the specific grave in a Gaza cemetery to a sweeping critique of how the entire world views this conflict.
This is section 3 in our stack, what the JTV transcript calls the Great Reverse. And I have to say, this is a part of the source material that is, it's very aggressive in how it challenges this narrative.
It fundamentally attacks the premise that most Western media and diplomacy is built on. The source argues that the world for decades has operated on a specific assumed sequence of events.
And that sequence is
Israel acts or provokes, and then the Palestinians resist.
That's definitely the common narrative. Israel builds a settlement in the West Bank, and then you see protests or attack. Israel establishes a checkpoint, and that becomes a flashpoint for violence.
Exactly. The Israeli action is always presented as the cause, and the Palestinian action as the effect. But this great reversal theory presented in the source says, hold on, stop and look at the actual timeline. Look at the data.
They argue that this narrative is factually back.
Completely inverted. The source makes a case by listing the major conflicts. 1948, the surrounding Arab nations invade the nascent state of Israel. 1967, Egypt masses its armies on the border, closes the Straits of Tiran, and calls for Israel's destruction. The Second Intifada starts after Israel offers the Palestinians a state at Camp David, and Yasser Arafat walks away and chooses violence.
And the most recent example they use is post-2005.
Right. After Israel withdraws from Gaza, the provocation of the occupation is gone, but the rockets start flying. The source's argument is that in every single one of these pivotal moments, the initial aggression came from the Arab side against Israel, and Israel's major military actions were a reaction, a defense.
So they're saying the world consistently mistakes the reaction for the provocation.
A deliberate and cynical reversal of cause and effect is the phrase the transcript uses. And to prove this point, the source leans very heavily on one specific large-scale historical experiment.
The 2005 Gaza
Yeah, this is their case study, and it's crucial to remember the details here for anyone who might be a bit hazy on that history. In 2005, under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, a right-wing hawk, Israel did something unthinkable.
They left Gaza?
Completely. Unilaterally. They didn't just pull the army out. They dismantled every single Jewish settlement. They sent soldiers in to physically drag Israeli citizens out of their homes.
I remember seeing those images, soldiers crying as they evicted settlers. It was a national trauma.
It was. They even exhumed the bodies from the Jewish cemetery in Gush Katif to move them to Israel, which, given what we've just discussed about the sanctity of graves, tells you how total this withdrawal was. They left nothing behind. No soldiers, no civilians, no settlements, zero.
It was the ultimate test of the land for peace formula.
It was the perfect laboratory. The international community had been saying for years, the violence is because of the occupation. End the occupation and you will get peace. So Israel ended the occupation of Gaza.
And the question the source relentlessly asks is, what happened next? What was the result?
Well, the result, as the transcript details, was not the creation of a peaceful democratic state. It wasn't the Singapore of the Middle East that people like Thomas Friedman were predicting.
No.
The result was the 2006 election, which Hamas won, and then the violent Hamas takeover in 2007, where they literally threw their political rivals from the Palestinian Authority off of rooftops. They ended democracy and turned the entire Gaza Strip into a fortified terror base.
So the argument from the source, we tried the world, we gave the land, ended the occupation, and in return, we got a terrorist state on our border.
And therefore, the source concludes, the land for peace model is fundamentally broken. It's based on a false diagnosis. It assumes the conflict is about territory, about real estate. The source argues the conflict is existential. It's about Israel's right to exist at all.
This leads into a very, very controversial section of the JT. It weighs into the concept of Palestinian.
Yes, and we need to be really precise here about what the source is arguing. It's making a specific and very provocative historical claim. It alleges that the modern political identity of Palestinianism was, in its words, cynically invented.
Invented is a huge word that's incredibly charged.
It is, but this attempts to back it up with a historical argument. It points to the period between 1948 and 1967. For those 19 years, who controlled the West Bank and Gaza?
Jordan controlled the West Bank, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip.
Correct. For 19 years, those territories, and the Arab populations within them were under the control of two major Arab nations. The source then asks the critical question, why didn't Egypt and Jordan create an independent Palestinian state during that time?
They certainly had the power to do so. There was no Israeli occupation to prevent it.
None whatsoever. The source argues that the fact they didn't, the fact that there was no major international movement for a Palestinian state then, proves that the goal was never about building a new Arab state. The goal was, and remained, the destruction of the existing Jewish.
So the argument is that this political identity only became a major international issue after Israel took control of those territories in the 1967 Defense War.
That it was weaponized as a tool to undermine Israel's legitimacy. Again, this is the argument presented in the source material. It's a very harsh perspective.
It uses a really stark analogy. It talks about the challenge of de-radicalizing a Nazi.
It does. It directly compares the multi-generational indoctrination of hatred in Gaza, in schools, in media, in mosques, to the political climate in Germany in the 1930s. The argument is that you can't build a lasting peace when the foundational identity of one side is the complete negation and demonization of the other.
And this critical view extends to pretty much all mainstream Western diplomatic efforts, specifically the economic...
Yes, the Jared Kushner approach. The idea that if you just give people economic opportunity of prosperity, jobs, nice hotel, that the desire for conflict will simply fade away.
The source views that as profoundly naive.
Utterly. It brings up what it calls the bin Laden counterpoint.
Was
Osama bin Laden poor? Was he lacking dignity or economic opportunity? No. He was a member of a billionaire Saudi family. He had every advantage in the world.
And yet he chose radical violent jihad.
Because of ideology. The source's point is that ideology is the prime move. It trumps economic. You cannot buy off a deeply held religious or political belief system that views your destruction as a sacred duty. You can't solve an ideological problem with this shopping.
So if the source argues that Land for Peace has been tested and failed and economic peace is naive, what solution does it propose?
Well, this is where the JTV transcript goes to a place that is far outside the bounds of conventional diplomacy. The source suggests a plan for remigration.
Remigration, as in moving the population.
Yes. The source points to the geography of the Middle East. It notes that the Arab Muslim world is vast, controlling a landmass 100 times the size of Israel. It argues that the logical long-term solution is not to try and cram a hostile population into a tiny state on Israel's border, a state that it claims will inevitably become a terror base.
But instead,
to facilitate the voluntary or incentivized movement of that population into the broader Arab world where, the source argues, they share a language, culture, and religion.
That's a non-starter in any internet. That would be condemned globally as ethnic cleansing.
Of course, it's an extremely radical proposal.
Yeah.
But we have to analyze what the source is saying. It presents this as the only logical conclusion if you accept their initial premise of the Great Reversal. If you believe the conflict is existential and that proximity guarantees perpetual war, then creating distance, they argue, is the only path to actual lasting.
And this kind of hardline thinking seems to be directly reflected in the political language we see in the next section of our material. Section 4. Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech after the recovery of Ran Gvilli.
Yes, you can draw a straight line from the philosophy of the JTV transcript to the policy articulated by Netanyahu. He's talking about the day after in Gaza. And it's what he doesn't talk about that's so significant.
He's not talking about the Palestinian Authority or reconstruction or international peacekeeper.
None of that. His language is focused on one thing, total victory. He defines the immediate next phase with two key objectives.
Disarmament and demilitarization.
The destruction of Hamas's military and governing capability and the complete demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. That is the explicit goal. He is saying, in no uncertain terms, we cannot even begin to talk about what Gaza will look like politically until we can be absolutely certain it no longer poses the physical threat to it.
Security first, everything else second.
It's the prerequisite for any other conversation. And he's not just focused on Gaza. He widens the lens considerably.
He looks east towards Iran.
He uses this metaphor of an octopus. He calls Iran the head of the octopus of evil. And its proxies, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, are the tentacles.
And he sends a very direct message in this speech.
It's not subtle. He says, any attempt by Iran to harm us will be met with a decisive and powerful response. He's using the successful conclusion of this operation in Gaza to project strength across the entire region. He's framing the fight for Ran Gvilli's body not as a local skirmish, but as one battle in a much larger regional war against the Iranian axis.
There's a theme that runs through both Netanyahu's speech and the JTV source, this idea of Jewish sovereignty. What does that mean in this context?
It means an end to outsourcing Israeli security. The source argues that the 2005 withdrawal from Gaza wasn't just a strategic mistake, it was a morally criminal act.
Strong words.
Very. Because, the argument goes, It betrayed the future of Jewish security by creating a vacuum that was immediately filled by terror. It relied on international guarantees and hopes that simply didn't hold up. Jewish sovereignty, in this context, means Israel alone will be responsible for the security of its border. It means no foreign peacekeepers in Gaza. It means Israel retains overriding security control.
The idea that only Israeli power can prevent that vacuum from being filled by chaos again.
That's the core of the argument. Which brings us to the final and, in some ways, most unexpected part of our source stack today.
Section 5, the Albanian connection.
This is a really fascinating piece of diplomatic theater. The transcript is from a joint press conference. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu on a podium, and standing next to him is Edi Rama, the Prime Minister of Albania.
Okay, for our listeners, let's place Albania on the map. It's a country in the Balkans in Southeast Europe, and critically, it is a Muslim-majority nation.
Overwhelmingly Muslim, which makes the optics alone very powerful. The leader of the Jewish state and the leader of a European Muslim state, standing together in solidarity. But the history here is even more remarkable. I'll admit, I wasn't fully aware of this story until I read the transcript.
The story of Albania during the Holocaust?
Yes. Albania was the only country in Nazi-occupied Europe where the Jewish population actually grew during World War.
Grew? How is that even possible?
Because the Albanians refused to cooperate with the Nazis. The source doesn't go deep into the cultural reasons, but it's tied to a traditional code of honor called besa, which means to keep the promise. It essentially obligates you to protect a guest with your own life.
And they considered the Jews their guests.
Both the native Albanian Jews and the Jewish refugees who fled there from other parts of Europe. When the Nazi authorities came and demanded the lists of Jews, the Muslim Albanian government and population refused. They hid them in their homes. They gave them Albanian names. They protected them. It's an incredible, unsung story of moral courage.
And Netanyahu clearly leverages this shared history to make a very specific point about the current conflict.
He does it brilliant. First, he draws the direct parallel. He says the Nazis of the past are the Hamas monsters of today. But the real strategic move is how he uses this alliance to reframe the entire global conversation about the war.
He's trying to shatter the simplistic Jews versus Muslims narrative.
He's blowing it up. He's literally standing next to a Muslim prime minister and saying, this is not a war against Islam. This is not a war against the Palestinian people. He frames it as a clash of civilization.
But he defines the two sides of that clash very differently.
Very. The dividing line isn't religion or nationality. It's ideology. On one side, he puts the modern enlightened forces who sanctify life, liberty, and progress. And on the other, the radical medieval forces of jihadist ideology that want to drag the world back into a dark age.
So he's building a coalition of moderates against extremists.
Exactly. He praises what he calls the moderate Islam of Albania as proof that Islam itself is not the enemy. He's saying to the world, we, the civilized nations, Jewish, Christian, and moderate Muslim alike, are in this fight together against a common barbaric enemy.
It's a very powerful piece of political framing.
But he's very clear that he does not include all of Europe in that civilized camp.
Oh, no. In fact, the source includes a section of this that is a scathing critique of West, particularly what he calls the progressive.
He accuses them of self-hatred. What's the argument there? The argument presented is that there are elements in the West who have become so critical of their own civilization, of Western value, that they reflexively side with the enemies of that civilization. He argues that by making excuses for or even supporting groups like Hamas, they are undermining the very values they claim to champion: women's rights, gay rights, freedom of speech, all things that radical Islamism would extinguish.
He calls out the International Criminal Court at The Hague and the campus protesters specifically.
He does. He points out the hypocrisy of students wearing keffiyehs and chanting for the liberation of Palestine while remaining completely silent about the brutal oppression of women in Iran or the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Muslims by other Muslims in Syria. He portrays it as a profound moral confusion in the West, contrasting it with the moral clarity of Albania, which stood with the Jews in the 1940s and stands with Israel.
Wow. It's an incredible amount of ground to cover. We've literally gone from the microscopic analysis of a tooth and a jawbone in a Gaza cemetery
all the way up to these grand, sweeping arguments about the clash of civilizations and the future of the West.
But that's the thing about this conflict, isn't it? The micro and the macro are always connected. You can't separate.
You really can't. The tactical operation to retrieve Sergeant Major Gvilli's body is driven by a timeless theological belief. That belief informs a modern national ethos. That ethos dictates a political doctrine of sovereignty, and that doctrine is defended on the world stage with arguments about the grand sweep of history.
It's all one interconnected story.
It is.
So as we start to wrap up Dive, let's try to bring it all together. Our mission today was to understand the significance of this moment, the recovery of the last known Israeli body from Gaza.
And I think the significance is too. On a practical level, it's what you call the clearing of the deck. That specific file, the hostage file inside Gaza that's been open since 2014, is now closed. It changes the equation.
And on a more philosophical level, the sources suggest that this moment ushers in a new era, defined by a reinterpretation of that famous phrase, never.
That's right. For decades, never again was a historical statement. It was a memorial, a promise to remember the past. The source material, both the political speeches and the JTV analysis, argues that October 7th transformed it. Never again is no longer a slogan about history.
It's an active military doctrine for the present.
Never again is now. That's the phrase they use. It means preemption. It means an end to policies of containment and deterrence that fail. It means, as the source argues, that you do not wait for the threat to fully materialize on your border. You act decisively to destroy it while you still can.
Okay, so let's leave our listeners with a final provocative thought to chew on, something that really emerges from the totality of these sources.
The hinge point.
The hinge point. We spent a lot of time on this great reversal, the idea presented in the source that the entire world has the cause and effect sequence of this conflict completely backward.
That for 75 years, the world has been misdiagnosing the illness.
So here's the question. If, and it's a huge if, but if that theory is true, if the source's rereading of history is correct, and the initial aggression has consistently come from the other side, what does that imply about every standard diplomatic current?
It implies that the medicine everyone is prescribing might actually be poison.
If the land for peace formula is built on the false premise that the conflict is about land, then every time you push for it, you're not solving the problem. You're potentially making it worse. You're feeding the...
But on the other hand, if that great reversal theory is wrong, if the standard narrative is actually correct, then this new Israeli doctrine of total victory and permanent security control is a catastrophic, dangerous path.
That's the fundamental wager. And as our sources make clear, the nation of Israel is currently betting its entire future on the belief that the reverse...
A truly profound thought to end on.
It is. As always, we encourage you to look at the source material for yourself. Don't just take our word for it. The details in the briefings, the arguments in the transcript, they're really worth it.
There's always more to uncover when you go directly to the source.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Take care.